Okay, let me get started. Welcome, everybody. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. Thanks for joining our 7th Annual North Korea Economic Forum Conference. This year's theme is Discerning North Korean Economic Strategies, Sanctions Enforcement, Trump-era Policies, and Geopolitical Realignment. I can't believe this is already 7th year. We started this conference in 2019. At the time, it was all in person, and we had a very limited number of people joining us because the people in the DMV area could join us at the time. But after COVID, we shifted to a virtual conference, and now I think we can reach out to the experts, speakers, and audience all around the world, which is great. I'm Yeonho Kim, Associate Director of GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWIX. We have distinguished three speakers for their congratulatory remarks. Let me briefly introduce them. First, Elisa Ayers is the Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Dean Ayers is a foreign policy practitioner and award-winning author with senior experience in the government, nonprofit, and private sectors. From 2013 to 2021, she was senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she remains an adjunct senior fellow. From 2010 to 2013, Dean Ayers served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia. Second, Jun Kyung Kim is the Dean of the KDI School of Public Policy and Management in Korea, our co-sponsor of this event and the policy program we are running at GWIX. He was also Secretary to the President for Financial Policy during the Lee Myung-bak administration and previously advised the Kim Dae-jung administration as a member of the Economic Policy Advisory Council. Dean Kim served on the advisory board of the World Bank's Global Delivery Initiative and led the establishment of the Development Research and Learning Network at the KDI School. Last but not least, Troy Stengaron is co-chair of the steering committee for the North Korea Economic Forum at GWIX, and he's a non-resident fellow with the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology. Previously, he was the director of the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy and the deputy director of the Indo-Pacific program at the Wilson Center. With that, let me turn it over to Dean Ayers.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kim, and welcome to everyone. Let me echo the welcome to everyone this morning or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. And thank you, Yeonho. Thank you, Professor Kim, for your opening remarks and for your leadership of GWIX. This is an important forum for us. Since it was launched in 2019, the North Korea Economic Forum here at GW has been recognized by North Korea watchers in Washington and beyond as a real center for knowledge sharing and network building, both private and public, on the North Korean economy. And the forum's annual conference has been providing North Korea watchers with a really unique opportunity to understand the North Korean economy in a holistic way. As you heard, this year we're going to delve in with a focus on discerning North Korean economic strategies, sanctions enforcement, Trump-era policies, and geopolitical realignment. So this year's program will open with a panel of next-generation scholars who will present innovative, open-source research on North Korea's economic aspirations using text analysis, satellite imagery, and trade data. Later sessions in the forum will examine the challenges of post-COVID open-source intelligence and the future of sanctions enforcement under shifting international alignments. We believe our work at the GW Institute for Korea Studies has tremendous ongoing real-world impact in the policy field. Many of our students go on to pursue careers in government, academia, think tanks, media, or work in non-governmental organizations with a lens on the policy world. Due to our location, our networks, and our convening power, we also take seriously the responsibility to consult with leading experts to provide the Washington audience with a variety of perspectives on the Korean Peninsula, and the North Korea Economic Forum illustrates this approach so well. Let me also thank the KDI School of Public Policy and Management, co-sponsor of this conference, for providing a generous grant to GWICS. And this has allowed us to host a series of truly meaningful Korea-related policy events, as well as to provide scholarships and stipends to GW students. We're thankful for this strong and ongoing cooperation between GWICS and the KDI School, and at a time when Korean studies has grown even more prominent. So we look forward to ongoing exchange with KDIS and to continuing to strengthen this wonderful partnership. So let me welcome everyone again. Kudos in advance on what looks like an outstanding conference program, and looking forward to the conversations ahead.
Thank you, Dean Ayers. Dean Kim.
Dr. Elisa Iris, Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs, and Dr. Celeste Arrington, Director of the Institute for Korean Studies, Mr. Troy Stangaron, Co-Chair of the North Korea Economic Forum, Ms. Raquel Min-young Lee, Co-Chair of the North Korea Economic Forum. Distinguished guests and colleagues and friends, good morning. It is a great honor to co-host this year's North Korea Economic Forum with the George Washington University Institute for Korean Studies. On behalf of the KDI School of Public Policy and Management, I warmly welcome all participants and extend my sincere appreciation to GWICS for its continued partnership and leadership. The forum has become the flagship of our long-standing collaboration, bringing together leading scholars, policymakers, and practitioners to deepen our understanding of North Korea's economy and society. Over the years, this partnership has produced policy dialogues and nurtured a new generation of scholars devoted to open, balanced, and data-driven analysis of North Korea. At the KDI School, we believe that academic inquiry should ultimately contribute to better policymaking. Our mission has always been to connect rigorous research with practical solutions, bridging academia and policy to serve the global public good. The North Korea Economic Forum perfectly embodies this mission, serving as a platform where evidence-based knowledge meets constructive dialogue. This year's theme, Discerning North Korean Economic Strategies Amid Sanctions, Trump-era Policies and Geopolitical Realignment, is both timely and thought-provoking. As global dynamics shift, understanding how sanctions, diplomacy, and domestic resilience interact within the North Korean system has never been more important. I look forward to the insightful presentations and the meaningful discussions that will follow over the next 2 days. I'm confident that our collective efforts here will contribute to more informed, forward-looking policy engagement on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
감사합니다. Thank you, Dean Kim. Troy.
Well, thank you, Yon-ho, and thank you, Dean Kim. I'd especially like to thank the KDI School of Public Management for its continuing strong support that has helped make this year's conference possible. But as anyone knows, any conference is something that requires extensive work by a lot of individuals. So I'd also like to thank you, Yon-ho, Haveen, Ravina, my co-chair, Rachel, on the steering committee, and the rest of the North Korea Economic Forum steering committee for all of the work you have put together to make this year's conference possible. As we begin this year's conference, we find ourselves at an inflection point. Only a few weeks ago, Kim Jong-un traveled to Beijing to join Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin at China's commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the Second World War. While the trip provided symbolic value for Kim, the now 2 years of active support that North Korea has provided to Russia for its war in Ukraine has reshaped the geostrategic and economic options for North Korea. At the same time, as we've heard in our other remarks, President Trump has returned to office with an increasingly expansive effort to reshape global geopolitics and the global geoeconomic order. And all of these factors take an impact North Korea in different ways. It is in this context that we look to examine how North Korea's economic strategies and foreign policy are evolving to reflect these changing dynamics. Over the next 2 days, we'll do this by looking, as Dean Ayers said, at some of the tools for examining North Korea's economy with a series of young experts who are at the forefront of examining some of these new types of open source ways to examine the North Korean economy, which we will begin today's discussion with. We'll also look at some of the constraints we've seen on open source information in the post-COVID era. And then tomorrow, we're delighted to have keynote remarks from Dr. Jung Pak, who served as the U.S. Special Envoy to North Korea, and she'll be focusing her remarks on the future direction of the North Korean political economy. Then we will conclude with a discussion of the future of sanctions enforcement with former UN panel of experts member Yvonne Yu. I'm looking forward to what I expect will be 2 days of simulating discussions and hopefully take and lead to some new insights as we deal with this important policy issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Troy. With that, let me turn it over to Rachel, who will be moderating the first session with the rising stars in the field of North Korean studies. Rachel?
Thank you for that, Yan-Ho. Good morning from Washington, D.C. I'm Rachel Min-Young Lee, co-chair of the North Korea Economic Forum. I'm excited to chair the first panel, which is a special panel exclusively for emerging scholars, to bring fresh perspectives on accessing and analyzing open source information about North Korea, which is undeniably the most closed country in the world. Today, we will explore 3 key open source tools used in North Korea analysis: text, satellite imagery, and trade data. We have 4 fabulous speakers lined up to walk us through their approaches to these tools with accompanying case studies. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Sarah Yoon, a visiting researcher at the Institute of North Korean Studies at Dongguk University, Ms. Ileana Ragnon, a research associate at the Stimson Center and managing editor of 38 North, Ms. Jennifer Jun is an associate fellow and project manager for satellite imagery analysis with Ideas Lab and the Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ms. Haley Wingo is a researcher at the London-based Verdicts Verification and Monitoring Program, where her work includes using open sources to better understand the DPRK's nuclear and chemical weapons programs. Please refer to our speakers' bios in the program for more information. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sarah Yoon. Sarah will present on North Korean text analysis with Kim Jong-un's Economic Development Zone's policy as a case study. Sarah?
Good morning and good evening, everyone. Nice to meet you online. My name is Sarah Yoon. I'm visiting researcher at the Institute of North Korea Study at Dongguk University. So today, I will be presenting a text analysis of North Korean publication under the theme Understanding North Korea's Economy Aspirations. First, let me now present a research overview. The question I asked in this study was, what kind of economic expectations are reflected in North Korean publication during the Kim Jong-un era? As for the method, I used qualitative content analysis. North Korean publications represent the most direct text produced within the system and therefore provide invaluable insights into the regime's intentions. While textual analysis alone may not be sufficient to fully understand North Korea, it is a necessary step. By finding and interpreting the meanings embedded in this text, researchers can uncover important clues about North Korea's economy realities. North Korea economic journals are especially useful for uncovering the regime's economic expectations. They present diagnosis and prescription formulated by North Korean scholars as they navigate the gap between theory and reality. Regarding the sources, this study focused mainly on 2 journals: the Journal of Economic Research, so-called 경제연구, and the Journal of Kim Il-sung University, Kim Il-sung 종합대학 학부. So in total, I reviewed 95 articles published between 2012 and the first half of 2025. I focus on keywords related to external economies, such as foreign economy, foreign trade, joint ventures, and economic development zones. Next, I'd like to talk about key findings on external economic relations and then on economic development zones. The first part I'd like to discuss is North Korea's external economic relations. From a macro perspective, it is important to understand how North Korea has shaped its external economic relations in response to changing global conditions. According to my research, North Korea publications have actively developed new discourses to handle these changing conditions. Interestingly, I found that there were two major turning points in these discussions. One is around 2016 and another around 2020. Between 2013 and 2014, publications showed a mixed view. However, for 2016 onward, the tone shift toward emphasizing active expansion of external relations. For instance, the documents state that North Korea's self-reliant economy should not be misunderstood as a closed economy, but rather as having a high level of external economy authority. They also emphasize the need to pursue diversification and multipolarization of trade. This shift can be understood as both a response to sanctions and an attempt to reduce dependence on China, which was especially high at that time. Next, from 2020 onward, the discourse began to highlight economy diplomacy. What is notable here is that North Korea specifically defined its target partner as countries that respect its sovereignty and maintain friendly relations. The document also presented various approaches, such as establishing reciprocal economic organization or using joint economic committees to promote cooperation. At the same time, they stressed the importance of linking these external efforts to domestic economic goals. For example, promoting investment in key industries through foreign trade to fulfill the 5-year National Economic Development Plan, or emphasizing technology trade to support science-based growth. Overall, these shifts reflect broader geopolitical developments, including the completion of North Korea's nuclear weapons program and the emergence of a multipolar global order. Given this context, North Korea is likely to continue focus its external economy engagement primarily on friendly nations such as Russia, China, and Southeast Asian countries for the foreseeable future. Now, I'd like to move on to key findings on economic development zones. From now on, I will refer to economic development zones as EDGs. I'd like to focus on EDGs from a micro level perspective. There are two reasons why I choose EDGs among many economic issues. First, EDGs are connected to various sectors such as tourism, trade, manufacturing, and technologies. Second, while data on tourism and trade, such as the number of visitors or trade volume, are relatively visible, the data on EDGs remain largely undisclosed. Now, I wanted to talk external stagnation versus internal proliferation. From an external perspective, this zone seems to have stopped working after stronger sanction in 2016 and the breakdown of talks in 2019 and the border shutdown in 2020 due to COVID-19. However, internal North Korean documents show that relative discussion continued during this time. Second, specific discussion topics. They not only stress the importance of EDGs, but also discuss practical issues such as attracting investment, building infrastructure, environment assessment, and managing workers. Next, I want to move on to the domestic linkages and implications. These zones are also connected to the domestic economy. The documents show that industry should develop with each region based on the zone's main focus, whether it is export, tourism, or technology. It also represents a shift in the economic discourse under Kim Jong-un. Unlike in the previous era, when special economy zones, 경제특구, were often isolated from the domestic economy, the EGDs under Kim Jong-un are designed to be more closely connected with the internal economy. A key feature of Kim Jong-un's approach is that not only central area, but also local regions can now host and operate EDGs. Information from North Korean sources about EDGs suggests that these projects remain ongoing. They remain one of the central pillars of Kim Jong-un's long-term economic strategy, a strategy that may take time, but is expected to keep progressing. Lastly, I'd like to talk about implications. Of course, textual analysis is not a perfect method for understanding North Korea. However, this kind of document analysis is significant because it provides insight into North Korea's implicit policy directions and development plans. From a policy perspective, it also identifies areas where practical cooperation may be possible, so we can design more realistic engagement strategy. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for that presentation, Sarah. And next, please welcome Ms. Ileana Ragnon. Ileana will present on the use of satellite imagery to understand Kim Jong-un's major economic development projects.
So thank you so much to Rachel for moderating this session and to the GW Institute for Korean Studies North Korea Economic Forum for the opportunity to be a part of this year's conference. I've actually attended in the past as a participant, so it's an honor this year to be on the other side amongst distinguished colleagues. Today I'm going to speak about the utility of open source data, specifically satellite imagery, as a tool for conducting analysis of North Korea's economy. I think satellite imagery is often an unsung source for economic analysis. In most cases, quantitative sources like trades and customs data provide more concrete data-driven metrics, which can lead some to believe that a picture or a snapshot in time doesn't particularly provide equivalent analytical value. But in a closed-off country like North Korea with inconsistent and often unreliable sources and a lack of on-the-ground reporting, satellite imagery is a crucial tool to gain a more full and holistic picture of what's going on, especially in a case study where other metrics are unreliable or unavailable. Specifically, combining satellite imagery analysis with other sources, like North Korean state media reporting, can help to provide a more holistic picture that can complement qualitative metrics when available. While the use of satellite imagery does certainly come with caveats, which I will discuss later on in my presentation, it can be a particularly useful tool in tracking the progress of North Korea's broader economic initiatives rather than the minutiae. For example, how fast construction projects are moving, if sites constructed are in locations that North Korean media reports they are being, and if there are any through lines or patterns for the placement or appearance of economic initiatives. To demonstrate an example of this use of satellite imagery, I'm going to be discussing North Korea's 20x10 regional development policy, tracking its progress against what we're able to glean from open source data, specifically satellite imagery. I'm sure many people attending today's discussion are familiar with the initiative, but if in case anyone is not, I'll give a brief overview. The 20x10 Regional Industrial Plan was announced in January 2024 by Kim Jong-un at a Supreme People's Assembly meeting. The initiative plans to build local industrial modernized factories in 20 cities and counties over a 10-year period, so set to complete in 2034. This is not the first development initiative to crop up in the last couple of years. Against the backdrop of Kim Jong-un's announcements at the 8th Party Congress in January 2021 for the Rural Housing Development Program and the Pyongyang Housing Initiative that pledged to and actually did complete 10,000 apartments over a 5-year period, the 20x10 policy was designed to be implemented alongside these other initiatives. While the 20x10 plan is not solely focused on rural areas, it does have an emphasis on reaching areas outside of Pyongyang, the capital city and a typical recipient of economic development, and therefore can be interpreted as an offshoot of rural construction development projects outside of urban centers. The goal of the project is to revitalize local industries and to bolster the ability for regional economies to function without the influence of the capital city. This shift away from capital-centric development instead represents a shift towards self-sufficiency, which in theory is a goal of the North Korean economic system, but in practice is largely resource-dependent and may not be fully realized. As the first named regional economic initiative of its kind, and one that he personally announced, Kim visited the first 20x10 site, Songcheon, to break ground, and has returned on several occasions since, which in itself indicates a high-level emphasis on this project. After the first year of the initiative came to a close in February 2025, Kim also announced an expansion of the scope of the 20x10 initiative. In addition to factories, other facilities that will augment citizens' livelihoods will be included, like hospitals, public health facilities, science and technology dissemination centers, and grand management facilities, with the goal of further increasing each region's self-sufficiency. This aligns with Kim's purported intent to improve people's living standards. He's quoted saying that he wants to develop the rural economy and other sectors of the local economy and improve the people's living standards with cities and counties as bases, and to transform agricultural workers on a revolutionary and working class pattern to boost state support to rural areas and build them up. Given the importance of this initiative, satellite imagery analysis has aided in tracking the progress of the plan. Using state media articles, photographs, and some time and patience, we as analysts can track which projects are opening and where. Analysis from the first year of the project, marked in February 2025, shows broad geographic distribution throughout the country. Throughout the first year of the project and into the second, North Korean state media often announced when a specific county was the recipient of a new 20x10 cluster of factories, or most recently, hospitals and other facilities. Given this information, it's been possible to narrow in on the specific geographic boundary that the project is contained within, and to utilize historical imagery to determine where construction has begun. Thus far into the second year, it appears that the new 20x10 projects are following a similarly evenly spaced geographic distribution. However, being so early into the decade-long initiative, it can't yet be determined how the distribution will evolve over time, and whether or not any one county will be precluded from receiving additional benefits or new facilities as the initiative continues. Thus far into the second year, we've actually already seen one such place where a new project has been built in the first and the second year. In Kusang specifically, a clothing factory, daily necessities, and foodstuff factories were all built. And in the second year, a big hospital is being built in the area, which Kim Jong-un has also visited. This pattern might continue throughout the country, but it's too early to tell for sure. Commercial satellite imagery can also provide insight into a few elements of construction to date, including the speed at which factories and facilities have been constructed, any through lines in the placement or appearance of these projects, and how often the counties mentioned in state media as recipients actually matched up with the actual construction projects. Largely, as you can see here, this is Songcheon, the first site of 20 by 10 visited by Kim Jong-un, factories have been clustered around this 3 little lot area. This was the first site broken ground on, and a similar pattern has been revealed at other locations as well. This is the Kusong factories, which I mentioned earlier, that have also been nearby the new hospital. One interesting pattern or observation that we've gleaned from satellite imagery has also been the interplay between factories and the surrounding agricultural farming infrastructure. In some cases, greenhouses were moved or taken down to make way for these factories, and in others, factories were constructed directly alongside pre-existing greenhouses. This could beg the question of whether or not this activity has an impact on the available resources required to operate the factories or serve as a base for ingredients for certain products. While the exact purpose, if any, is a little unclear, these actions could be due to little available land for the factory's footprints. This is one example of a limitation of utilizing satellite imagery to explain economic development patterns. While some patterns and activity come to light, the underlying often remains unknown. There are some limitations, specifically with the 20 by 10 project, and which leave several outstanding questions. Like with past economic projects that we've observed, like the ones on Kalma Beach Resort and the Pyongyang General Hospital, construction is often stalled due to a lack of resources to complete the interiors of the building. We're also not sure where source materials are being sourced and what the distribution is like once goods are produced within the factories. With infrastructure itself, the factories are only as strong or stable as the way that they're built and their structural integrity. We've seen over time other development projects, such as rural housing in the Komdok mining community and at Siniju, where natural disasters and weather have wiped out certain developments due to a lack of stability. And lastly, we have very little information on what the interior of these factories look like. Satellite imagery can only capture the exterior of the buildings from certain angles. Unless North Korean state media has shown us what's inside the factories, it's difficult to determine what's being produced, how much is being produced, and what we see in state media is likely produced and designed for public consumption. There's much more to say, but I will leave it at that and turn it back over to Rachel.
Thank you very much for that, Ileana. Next, we have Ms. Jennifer Jun. Jen also will present on the use of satellite imagery, but with a focus on North Korea's sanctions evasions activities.
Thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here, and thank you to GWIX and the KDI School for hosting this great conference. I'm looking forward to the rest of the conference, and I've already really enjoyed Sarah and Ileana's presentation. I want to add on Ileana's fantastic presentation on satellite imagery and looking at economic activities on that, and kind of shift our focus to satellite imagery for sanctions monitoring. In my years at CSIS, I've had the opportunity to analyze thousands of satellite images of North Korea. And building on this experience, I'd like to discuss specifically how imagery can support sanctions monitoring over North Korea. And my goal today is for you to walk away with 3 main takeaways. One is a practical sense of what satellite imagery can and cannot show us about covert activities. Second is awareness of best practices for the production of imagery analysis, but perhaps more importantly, consumption of imagery analysis in a really challenging information environment. And third is some real case studies that showcase applications of imagery analysis. So I'd like to start by setting the context. With the UN panel of experts disbanded in 2024 and North Korea's expanding military cooperation with Russia, traditional monitoring mechanisms have weakened at a really critical moment. And multilateral efforts like the MSMT continue the work of the UNPOE, but they remain comparatively limited. And so that's why commercial satellite imagery and open source methods are now critical in closing these monitoring gaps. And satellite imagery is unique in that it provides a literal physical view into denied areas like North Korea. It has the power to challenge or confirm our understanding of the country, but it's not perfect. So imagery faces significant constraints, some of which Ileana has touched upon, and other limitations like limited revisiting timing of collection of imagery, cloud coverage, and of course the challenges of camouflage, concealment, and deception on the part of North Korea. There are various types of satellite imagery that help combat these limitations in different ways, like infrared or synthetic aperture radar imagery. Remote sensing analysis can also be supplemented to further leverage satellite data for new insights. For example, thermal imagery to detect heat signatures, or NDVI analysis, normalized difference vegetation index, to measure vegetation health. But there's no single type of imagery that's foolproof. So each has strengths and limitations, which makes it really crucial to recognize that imagery isn't a standalone solution. And given these limitations, it's really important to remember that satellite imagery is just one tool in the toolkit. And imagery analysis is most effective when it's practiced with domain, cultural, and operational understanding, and paired with other data or analysis, some of which our other panelists will be talking about today or have talked about today. With this in mind, there are some key best practices in imagery analysis that I'd like to touch upon before we look at some case examples. And these are best practices that we should practice in imagery analysis or look for when we're consuming imagery analysis products. And some of those are establishing a baseline or a pattern of life. Understanding the baseline activity over an area of interest is crucial so we can notice abnormal activity. And recognizing and identifying indicators of sanctions evasion requires knowing what to look for. So the indicators of an arms transfer is going to look very different than the indications of fuel deliveries, for example. And trained eyes catch these indicators specific to what you're looking for. Oftentimes when something isn't happening, that gets dismissed. Oh, there's nothing happening, it's not exciting, there are no changes. But negation is also oftentimes very valuable. Sometimes the absence of evidence or lack of something happening speaks volumes. For example, when vessels disable their AIS signals, AIS is sort of like GPS or locational data of vessels. When they're turning that off, that speaks volumes. Deliberate calibration of monitoring frequency of imagery that you're using to study is also really important. Understanding the appropriate cadence of activity and knowing how often you need to be looking at imagery is going to be crucial in catching what you're looking for. And it's going to vary greatly depending on what you're looking for. Is it a daily event that you should be monitoring, or is it maybe monthly? And perhaps most importantly, good imagery analysis must separate what we observe from what we infer from it. So, avoiding pitfalls like confirmation bias and using clear words of estimated probability. So, probable, saying something is probable is very different to me than saying something is highly likely, for example. But over to what you're really here for, which are cool images. Here's a case study of how satellite imagery can be used and paired with other sources of data to produce meaningful analysis. So from August 2023 to early 2024, we analyzed satellite imagery, hundreds of them, to document at least 25 shipments of likely munitions from North Korea to Russia. We observed recurring vessel visits, suspicious cargo handling, and abnormal traffic patterns at Najin port that clearly deviated from the baseline pattern of activity there. And this analysis was also supported by AIS signal analysis, which we saw these vessels appear at really busy Russian ports with their AIS signals turned off. And that's a little bit akin to trying to drive a really large pickup truck blindfolded in a really busy parking lot. If there isn't a reason for you to do that and take that risk, you wouldn't be doing it. And so our findings, combined with other sources of open source intelligence available at that time, like government release information, pointed to highly probable munitions transfers at these locations. And this analysis, for example, was cited in the UN panel's final report in early 2024. And I think it shows really the value of imagery analysis in sanctions monitoring, especially over North Korea. Here's another example. At Yongbyon, where North Korea's nuclear reactors are located, satellite imagery showed water discharge coming out from the 5 megawatt reactor water discharge pipe, which you see in the black and white satellite imagery. Thermal imagery analysis was then conducted to also confirm then heated cooling water flowing into the river. So the cooling water that was used by the reactor, which is obviously now heated because it was used to cool the reactor, was seen coming into the river. And so together, they provided really strong evidence that the reactor was active and it was running. Another example is rail traffic at the border. So following Putin's visit to North Korea in 2024, satellite imagery revealed record levels of ore and tank cars crossing at the North Korea-Russia rail border. And what we observed wasn't just routine trade. It signaled large-scale transfers of coal and petroleum that likely bypass UN reporting requirements and may have violated sanctions. And this demonstrates how imagery analysis can pinpoint specific activities that merit further international scrutiny and investigation. As these cases that I've just touched upon illustrate, the real strength of imagery lies in how we use it. And this brings me to my final point. Satellite imagery is an important tool for uncovering sanctions violating activities, but it's most effective when it's integrated with other sources of information and analyzed with rigor. And ultimately, the North Korea watching community and policymakers will benefit most when we uphold strong evidentiary standards when looking at imagery. And I truly believe that that's how imagery analysis can remain effective and policy relevant as a sanctions monitoring tool as that landscape evolves in the post-POE era. Thank you. Over to Rachel.
Jen, thank you very much for that excellent presentation. Last but not least, please welcome Ms. Haley Wingo. Haley will present on monitoring North Korea's chemical imports to understand the state of the North Korean chemical industry.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today and to serve on this panel. I think there's been 3 absolutely fantastic presentations by my fellow panelists. Thank you to the NK Economic Forum team for all of your hard work in convening the conference. It's really a pleasure to be here today. My name is Haley Wingo. I'm a researcher at BERTIC in the Verification and Monitoring Program, and I'll be presenting today on a paper I actually co-wrote with Jack Crawford, who is a research fellow at RUSI. We initially began this work under a project led by RUSI called Project Anthracite that is funded by the Canadian government and seeks to use open sources to look at North Korea's capability for production of chemical weapons. And under this project, more broadly, we began this strand of work looking at trade data. Along the way, obviously, we started the work with looking specifically for insights into maybe ways they were circumventing sanctions, but it has also led to what I hope are some useful insights on its chemical industry. So just to provide a bit of background, North Korean chemical industry is spread throughout the country. That being said, some of the largest industrial hubs are located quite centrally in this band going across from Anju and Suncheon in the west, all the way over to Hamhung and Hungnam areas in the east. Between these hubs, you see various large Vinalon complexes, fertilizer factories, pharmaceutical factories, R&D institutes, and large petrochemical complexes, including the Namhang Youth Chemical Complex in Anju. Some of the main sectors that we see in North Korea for their chemical industry include coal processing, textiles and polymers, agricultural with a focus on production of fertilizers, herbicides, and insecticides, and WMD-associated sites, and pharmaceutical. Just to give a brief kind of summary of these, for coal processing, the 2 main functions we see tend to be coal gasification, which is how they convert coal into a mixture of hydrogen and carbon monoxide, both of those being quite important feedstocks for a wide array of chemical processes. And then coal liquefaction, which is the conversion of coal into liquid fuels like gasoline and diesel. I think in terms of what sanctions North Korea is under, it makes quite a lot of sense why they would put a focus on that. And then further with textiles production, Vinalon especially is a North Korean invention and thus upheld as kind of this prime example of juche. And then there, of course, the emphasis on agricultural products makes a lot of sense, given that North Korea likely experiences a lot of difficulties. And so these projects fulfill not just the function of fertilization and feedstocks, but also they're kind of improving the perception of the chemical industry in the eyes of the North Korean populace. And then while most sites in North Korea seem to have some dual use potential, at least, there are some sites that are linked very closely with the nuclear program. So some of these are Mampo Unha, which supplies chemicals for fuel processing to Yongbyon, and Pyeongsan, which provides Yongbyon with natural uranium isolated from coal deposits. Generally, there are some assumptions we have about limitations on North Korea's chemical industry. First of all, we see a lot of processes that are outdated and inefficient by modern standards. And the assumption here is that these were developed in the 1930s to 1980s when North Korea had more access to the equipment that they would need and more technical support, first from Japan and then from the Soviet bloc. And as it's become increasingly isolated, it's lost the ability to both acquire the knowledge that it needs to implement newer processes and to acquire the equipment and materials it needs for those newer processes. And actually, I'll skip to the last point there, which is This in some ways has led to what is an apparent failure, or at least significant delays in some of the more modern projects and processes. So examples of these are two processes in Sunshan, which are the C1 plant and phosphatic fertilizer complex, both of which, were showcased as these very modern, more automatic processes that are using more cutting edge. It's still kind of not the newest, but it's much more modern. But they seem to have encountered some difficulties, particularly since they kind of got off the ground in the pandemic, where there was a lot of announcement in 2020 and 2021. And then since then, there's been very little evidence of significant output from either of those facilities. And then finally, the middle point, which is because of their limitations and their isolation, there's a heavy reliance on raw materials that are available domestically. So especially on coal, which they have very large deposits of, but also limestone, glauberite, phosphate rock, brine. If they can get a mineral from something in the ground, they're most likely going to try to do that. And so a lot of their industry is heavily focused on extraction. So you'll see a lot of large furnaces, a lot of rock and ore processing facilities. So this was just kind of a context and background. And this is what we've come across. You can see on the right of the screen, these are kind of a summary of the publications we've been putting out. We've been doing profiles under this project Anthracite that's given some very helpful context as we've sort of tried to dive into the trade data. For the trade data, we used mirrored export and import trade data for the World Customs Organization Harmonized Standard, chapters 28, which covers inorganic chemicals, and 29, which covers organic chemicals. And initially, we were coming at this with more of a sanctions evasion perspective. And so we used third-party trade data in the hope that it would provide more detail on suppliers, and we'd be able to map kind of these procurement routes through that, which we had some success on. However, some of the sources didn't have the coverage we wanted of Chinese suppliers. That being quite a big gap, we then looked back at Chinese customs data, but it doesn't reveal as much information. So you'll have some countries that will report things like the supplier's address, and we just weren't getting that level of detail. So this data went back as far as 2015. That was the initial source we were using. So we stuck with that time frame throughout this project. And it did seem like an appropriate window to focus on because it includes the raft of 17-18 sanctions, which took effect in 2017, and then the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects. But for this analysis that I'll be covering in the coming slides, it's based on UN Comtrade data. And we looked at some of these more granular data sources when we wanted further information on, say, country level shipments. But for the broader trends, it is Comtrade data based on the harmonized standard codes. And as many of my other panelists have said, there are limitations, of course, and I think it is important to acknowledge this. For trade data analysis, North Korea does not publish its trade data, so only mirrored data is available. This leads to this amalgamation of national data sets of mirrored data. So in theory, we could have reduplication if there are transshipments that are being re-reported. And also just countries have different ways of reporting their mirrored data. So it can lead to inconsistency depending on the reporting country. Same thing that we kind of ran into with the third-party reporting as well. Finally, it's not safe to assume that trade with North Korea is accurately nor completely documented. It's very difficult to identify when goods are misrepresented in the data. And there are kind of these alleged examples of, for example, North Korea importing the primary chemical needed to produce methamphetamines as imports of flour. There's no way for us with just the trade data to confirm or corroborate those reports, but it is something we've very much kept in mind as we've been going through all of this. With that being said, we've come up with 4 insights. So the first of which is that North Korea remains heavily dependent on its chemical imports. It consistently imports more chemicals than it exports, which probably indicates that its domestic chemical industry is not sufficiently meeting its needs. With that being said, from 2015 to 2024, North Korea imported at least 600,000 tons of chemicals, which is significantly more than countries of similar GDP purchasing power parity per capita, which goes to show that GDP is not the best metric for North Korean industry, but also that it does have this significant focus because of Juche and because of its difficulties in importing maybe the daily goods that it needs. There's an emphasis on trying to do what its chemical industry, what it can, with significant kind of barriers to doing so. And then finally, the last point is that China is by far the largest supplier that we saw even in the UN Comtrade data for North Korea's chemical industry. It's followed by India, Russia, Trinidad and Tobago, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, and Germany in terms of rough amount of imports. The second insight is that North Korea's chemical industry remains rudimentary. So of those chemicals that were imported by North Korea, methanol, soda ash, and amino acids likely made up the largest shares by value from 2015 to 2024. And just to explain what that means a little bit, methanol and soda ash are quite basic and relatively easy to produce. They serve as feedstocks for a lot of other processes. But if North Korea is having trouble producing those, it shows both a reliance on methanol and soda ash in the rest of its chemical processes, but also indicates bottlenecks or failures in production of methanol from domestic raw materials, which is quite a fundamental chemical process and might indicate some more serious gaps in what it says it can produce versus what it is actually able to produce. And then that last group of amino acids is they likely serve to treat nutritional deficiencies. Actually, that is one of the uses. And in the amounts that they're importing them, that might be explained by that. And then finally, North Korea also imports catalysts in much smaller amounts, but that is not surprising. So catalysts are largely unconsumed in reactions. And so this implies that North Korea is not able to, or at least chooses not to attempt the more complex process of manufacturing catalysts, but then also relies on them a lot for their utility because they reduce the energy required for many reactions. The third insight is just the impact of COVID-19 and 17-18 sanctions. You can see dips in both of those years when we would expect to, that they might have caused significant contraction in North Korea's chemical industry. So the trade in chemicals dropped during COVID-19 very significantly. You can see that on the graph. Each of those lines just represents a different HS code, so a different group of chemicals being imported. And this was more significant in this drop for inorganic chemicals than organic chemicals, which could reflect a contraction of industrial manufacturing during lockdowns. And then secondly, the diversity of imports was already decreasing before COVID. So that might be more of the 17-18 sanctions impact, where the most necessary commodities might have been prioritized as sanctions and lockdowns impeded procurement. It is also possible, of course, that we're seeing a trend of just less honesty in reporting from North Korea's trade partners since 2017. So maybe those chemicals are still being imported, but they're being reported under different groups. And again, it's quite difficult to tell that. And then finally, the fourth point is just kind of this question about what North Korea is able to export. So even though it does import significantly more than it exports, its exports are fairly high, given the constraints that we expect to see on its chemical industry. And so it is quite interesting to look at what they have in enough excess to export. In 2015, what they exported has changed quite significantly from 2015 to 2024. There's an increased emphasis now on raw materials. So they might be shifting back from more complex processes, might have less capacity for complex manufacturing than they did in 2015. And it's difficult to determine exactly what is in each of the groups, but we do have enough granularity on the HS codes to tell what group of chemicals it is. So for example, 2015, the most exported item was terephthalic acids, which is a type of chemical that made up over a quarter of its exports. And its primary use is making polyester, very common in plastics manufacturing, also used in textiles and paint coatings. So the demand for terephthalic acid doesn't appear to have dropped. So they still appear to be making textiles and plastics in roughly the same amounts. But their ability to supply that key chemical in country has dropped. And in contrast, you can see silicon carbides made up over a third of exports in 2024. For that, all that's needed is a high temperature furnace, carbon, and silica sand. So it's much simpler to produce. And interestingly, right behind that is sodium cyanide, which is significant interest from a chemical weapons perspective, and possibly could indicate that the industry has cut back on civilian industry, but not deprioritized any production of interest for WMDs. So with all this said, we didn't look at how the rhetoric from the regime around the chemical industry shifted between 2015 and 2024. And this, I think, would be a valuable extension of this work to perhaps understand more about what drove these changes. Happy to answer more questions, but I'm mindful of time, so I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Haley. The four speakers have provided an excellent overview of the opportunities and challenges in using text, satellite imagery, and trade data to analyze North Korea. One common thread that I see across all the presentations is that one tool cannot stand alone and has to be used in tandem with other tools to maximize accuracy. To maximize our 30-minute or now 21-minute time slot, I will forgo commentary on each presentation and move directly to questions, one for each speaker. And following that, I'd like for us to have a group discussion on a topic that weaves together several threads concerning OSINT and North Korea. And we will, of course, address questions from the audience as we go. First, I'd like to start with Sarah. I have a question about how you collect and analyze a North Korean text. Is there a specific tool that you use to facilitate your collection and analysis of large volumes of North Korean text? For example, text mining or AI?
Thank you, Rachel. That's a great question. There are two aspects I like to mention regarding data collection. First, converting existing materials into text data can be challenging, as they must be transformed into machine-readable form for text mining. For example, the Bank of Korea's 2020 report analyzed only titles and keywords from the 경제연구, not full text. Early OCR attempts showed low accuracy, but with deep learning, this process has become much more manageable. Recently, Kinu successfully digitized 228 full-text articles from the Journal of Economics Research through collaboration with AI Research Institute. Second, collecting already digitized text data is possible through North Korean websites such as newspaper, journals, and online bulletins. However, since accessing this site is illegal in South Korea, for analysis, R and Python are commonly used, but North Korean language data presents challenges. The NKDIA, North Korea Data Intensive Analysis Tool by KIST, which include a morphological analyzer for North Korean terms, is freely available online and support its analysis, as well as custom stop word and synonym dictionaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'd like to turn it over to you now, Ileana. I think your presentation highlighted the evolution of the use of satellite imagery to analyze in North Korea. My understanding is that in the early years, satellite imagery was used mostly for tracking North Korea's WMD activities, but you have shown that satellite imagery is useful also for tracking progress of North Korean economic projects. You kind of touched on this in your presentation, but how do you address the limitations or challenges of using satellite imagery to do your work?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I think, as with any data source, there are, of course, limitations. And I know Jennifer touched on some of these in her presentation as well. Specifically with the economic sites, they're a little bit less high priority and can be kind of hidden, not as main sites that satellite imagery companies choose to revisit. So I think frequency of imaging is a challenging limitation that we often find to do that. And when you do get an image, there's also the question of whether, is it clear, what can you see, and resolution, how high is the resolution, what kind of detail can you glean. So those are all just things to kind of keep in mind as you're dealing with some of these less high priority sites. I think something else that is good to keep in mind as well is that satellite imagery is just a snapshot in time, and it's really difficult without frequent coverage of the same sites from the same times to discern any sort of patterns of life, traffic, etc. And so I think that that's one challenge that we often deal with when looking at economic issues, is to make sure to understand that there's a scope of possibilities and that you want to understand the limitations of what you can infer. So instead of saying there is a truck here on this day, that must mean that the factory is operating. It's important to kind of bear in mind that while there is a truck there, that might indicate a number of things. And that's something that we have to highlight in our analysis as well.
Thank you, Ileana, for that. Jen, in your presentation, you mentioned satellite imagery as being just one tool in the toolkit, and I love that expression. How critical are the other types of expertise that you have mentioned, such as satellite imagery, as for a satellite imagery analyst? So, for example, subject matter expertise, language proficiency, and cultural familiarity.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I think those things that you just outlined, they're what separate imagery observation from imagery analysis. And so real analysis is, looking at patterns and indicators beyond just the raw image, what you see in the pixels themselves, right? It's piecing together the patterns and the processes and the abnormal activities, if applicable, that draw on knowledge from diverse domains. And these may be a mix of cultural, technical, and operational insight. The more you know, the more you see, right? And so being familiar with the physical realities of, say, port operations, railroad construction, and industrial patterns and things like that, knowing what the nuclear plant chemical processes are like is going to help you decipher the truck traffic patterns in imagery, right? And really important to know what you don't know, so you know where to learn. You can figure out where to learn it. So, for example, I might reach out to Haley to ask about, some chemical details of a chemical plant that I'm looking at. And so I have a really fun, interesting example of what can go awry when you don't have that type of knowledge. Specifically, cultural familiarity for this example. We had a AI company that was using AI to essentially develop a tool for analyzing large amounts of imagery, and they wanted to kind of test their product for us and kind of show what they can do. And so we said, okay, great. So here is a sample 50 square kilometer area of North Korea. Tell us what you see. And they came back and they were very excited, and they said, oh, our AI found hundreds of SAM sites, surface to air missile launch sites, in this 50 square kilometers. And I see Ileana and Sarah and Haley already smiling, because that's impossible, right? North Korea as a country does not have that many SAM sites. And so we said, that doesn't sound right. Why don't you go back and try to refine your algorithm? And they said, okay. So they went back, they came back, and they said they got it down to about 100. And we said, all right, let's see what you're looking at. And the moment they shared their screen and showed us what the AI tool was detecting as SAM sites, we kind of chuckled, because they were traditional Korean burial mounds. So, those with the cultural familiarity will understand, the burial mounds from satellite imagery, look very similar to round SAM sites. And so the AI, without the cultural knowledge, or the individuals who are developing these algorithms without that cultural knowledge and knowing to, understand, oh, these are traditional burial sites in Korea, were flagging these as SAM sites. And imagine the headlines, right? If that went out and said, North Korea has hundreds of SAM sites around the country. So this is a short example of what can go awry. And so, people are always surprised when we're passing by railroad stations or electric, factories and things like that. And I said, oh, this is that. And they're like, how do you know this? And so, when we're looking at a railroad station in North Korea, I'm not just looking at that image. I'm going in and learning about the history of railroads in North Korea, how it's different from the Russian railroads, what the construction of railroads look like, and learning that and having that technical, cultural, and operational understanding, I think, is really crucial in providing, analysis at the highest level. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Jen, for those insights. Haley, you drew a number of insights, which I find impressive given the limitations of trade data. You noted or you indicated that you relied on other sources besides trade data. So which open source did you find the most useful for your research, besides obviously trade data?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think primarily there was actually a lot of reliance on North Korean sources. So for chemical industry, and I think this is maybe a function of they're quite used to being observed for WMD specific capability, so they won't share as much. But when they're talking about their chemical industry and their fertilizer production, say, the audience primarily is domestic. And so they are more open than you would expect. And so it was KCNA and Pyongyang Times that would just say, oh, well, this person visited this site and talked about this, and they talked to the workers from the methanol synthesis workshop, which tells you, okay, they say they synthesize methanol there, just to give an example. And so that kind of primary source analysis was quite useful. I think, unfortunately, actually, I'm going to butcher the name, I'm so sorry. Iriminizokiri was really useful for technical detail about the chemical sites. I think probably because of its focus towards Korean reunification, so it wanted to provide even more detail and selling it even more. But now that it's no longer active, it's probably not as, it can't be relied upon anymore. And then patent literature as well for useful information on the materials produced, the catalysts used, and just, they'll share what processes they're using, or at least enough detail that you can infer. If you have an idea of, most chemicals, there are a set of finite processes towards them. And so it's almost a process of elimination, actually, when you're looking at the North Korean literature of, okay, well, they don't have this capability, they don't appear to, but they do appear to have this, so they're more likely to follow this route. And then on the other hand, I think for relying on NGO research, we did a lot of background for this project. And so there were 3 general types that we relied on. First was general mapping. And actually, my fellow panelists, we used a lot of CSIS and 38 North imagery because they've done a lot of great work on profiling the sites already, and just doing like patterns of life and timelines and a lot of the sense of the history of those sites. And then there have been other reports, I think by International Crisis Group and RAND have done both these really large scoping of past intelligence reports and have kind of compiled all these sites into one. So one of the maps I showed in the presentation came from one of those reports. The second type was these case studies of illicit proliferation. So really deep dives into how one specific type of equipment, or say arms transfers, or I think my primary example would be, David Albright did a look at how a specific furnace got into North Korea through a lot of transshipment. And that was really helpful just in terms of kind of putting scope for our project of saying, well, we're not looking for that, but if we were to, that would probably be another avenue to go down, of not looking at the broader trends of trade data, but looking to find out how these specific proliferation pathways would work. And then the last was just the broader trade data analysis and how it was actually done. So my background is more so on the chemical side and less so on the trade data, and it's been an excellent learning experience. We looked at a lot of previous North Korea Economic Forum conference publications, actually, to see how practitioners have used this kind of data in their analysis, and for methodology, best sources, et cetera. And it was still a learning experience actually applying that, but it was very helpful to have that precedent from experts in the field.
Thank you, Haley, for those thoughtful answers. We have 2 questions from the audience that I'd like to address before we go into our discussion. The first is from our William Brown, who is a member of the North Korea Economic Forum. He starts off with praise for all of the presenters for their concise and thoughtful coverage of the topics, to quote him on that comment. So his question is, I think this is for Ileana mainly, but of course the others can jump in if they would like. Can text analysis or imagery give any hints of whether the zones and 20 by 10s? So I think what he means is the zones that were developed as part of the 20 by 10 policy, whether these zones are independent of each other or are centrally organized. For instance, do factories look similar across the zones? Whether transport between them is being developed.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that's a good question. And if there's anything also that, Sarah, you want to add on the text and especially economic zone side, feel free to jump in. I think what we see about the 20 by 10 project does imply that all of these clusters are kind of centrally organized. They look very similar throughout the country, dependent or regardless of geographic location. And they all are kind of announced in a similar fashion when they are constructed and built. And just given kind of Kim Jong-un's focus and intention on the project, it does appear to be kind of a top-down, centrally organized initiative. How the factories themselves are operating, I think is still a little bit unclear, and whether or not once they're actually built, they're kind of left up to the individual regions to kind of supply. So that is kind of an outstanding question, as well as the infrastructure between them. I don't believe that we have seen anything talking about how they're connected in any way, just kind of as a result of a lack of ability to freely move and easily travel between regions and areas within the country, and kind of the design to make each regional area a little bit more self-sufficient kind of tells me that they're localized and only intended to be for any specific region. But yeah, that will be something interesting to watch in the remaining 8+ years of this project. So yeah, we look forward to looking at those things as well.
Thank you, Ileana. Sarah, did you have anything to add from a text analysis point of view, how 20 by 10 policy or project is run?
The recent regional economy development policy differs from previous period in that it includes support from the central government. So the Worker Party has established a special committee and created a specialized unit for factory construction. The committee provides research for the initial construction. However, subsequent operations are left to the regions to manage them independently. So the Kim Jong-un era exhibits decentralization, centralizing only the bare minimum and allowing the rest to be managed independently. So this concept is described in great detail in internal documents and laws.
Thank you, Sarah. We have a second question from Haegyang Hwang. Thank you for sharing your valuable insights. I have a question for Jennifer Jun. I was impressed by the photos detecting changes in river temperature. Does CSIS independently acquire satellite imagery for image analysis? I'm also curious whether there is a separate team dedicated to the analysis of those images.
Yeah, the thermal imagery analysis that we saw in one of the case examples, that is freely available. That's actually open source and also publicly, it's free. So we utilize Landsat imagery, which is provided. You can download that data on USGS on their website. And we use the Landsat data to conduct the thermal analysis using ArcGIS, so like a GIS software. You could do it with a QGIS, you could do it with QGIS. And so the resulting analysis is actually just data. And so what we do is we used a separate piece of EO satellite imagery, what we see kind of we think of as photos, and lay that underneath a sort of a transparent overlay with the thermal imagery analysis. There isn't a separate team, so it's just our imagery analysis team here at CSIS that also handles the thermal and some other types of remote sensing analysis we've done.
Thank you, Jen. We have about 3 minutes left. I am actually a little sad because I was really looking forward to a group discussion with all 4 of you on the field of North Korea studies and the challenges, the credibility of data, and hence the credibility of analysis, and what you as emerging scholars can do to maybe improve the field's approach to the collection, research, and analysis, and what the more experienced North Korea watchers, myself included, along with many in the audience, can do to help you. However, with those 3 minutes left, why don't we do this? Why don't the 4 of you take turns, maybe take about a minute to answer 2 questions. What steps can you, as emerging analysts, take to improve the field's approach to collection, research, and analysis? And secondly, what can the more experienced North Korea watchers do to support you or help you with your endeavors? So who do we start with? Who wants to go first?
I can go quickly.
Okay.
Thanks, Rachel. I think those are good questions. And yeah, I'm also a little bummed that we won't be able to talk amongst ourselves a bit longer. I think one thing to help improve to your first question, I think this is Jennifer and Haley also, I think, touched on this in their presentations, but working with other kind of emerging scholars and colleagues that are also specializing in different areas, but of course they're all interrelated, and finding ways to kind of reach out and peer review amongst ourselves, I think is something that is really useful, as a lot of us are doing kind of the nitty-gritty research and might have not only lessons learned about our processes and data collection itself, but also about the subject matter. So I think that is really useful on that front. And then in terms of how those that are more established in the field can assist us, I think giving us platforms like this to share our insights and our work is really useful and helpful for us to not only practice presenting, but also to have a little bit more floor to share our research and goings on. So I'll stop there quickly, rapid fire.
Thank you.
I can also jump in. I mean, we could talk about this for an hour, right? What steps can us as emerging analysts take? Some may agree, some may not. I am an advocate of remaining conservative and transparent in the language and the analysis that we provide. So while we could say, 100 plus, trade, munitions trade, having the courage to say, actually, the conservative number is going to be at least 25. It's not going to be what is published, and it's not going to be a sensational finding. It's not going to be something that is news friendly, but it prioritizes accuracy and transparency. And having that environment where you prioritize that over sensationalized headlines is only going to that's going to be critical in creating this foundation, which we build on to understand something as something happens. And so something that's far more valuable in policy and scholarship and public debate. And that goes back to the words of estimated probability that I mentioned as a specific example of that. But what can the more experienced watchers do for us? Sort of what Ileana said, having that channel. But also North Korea is a really unique subject in that it changes so much, but it also doesn't at the same time. I'm kind of reminded of what Haley said in her presentation about a lot of the infrastructure is very, very, very old. A lot of the, even on the military side, a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the weaponry is building on Soviet era infrastructure and, hardware. So having the more experienced North Korea watchers who've been doing this for decades be able to pass on that tacit knowledge that they have from watching North Korea, I think can provide and help set emerging analysts up for building on that, not just having to work back and develop that understanding as well. So having these types of opportunities to share this tacit knowledge is really, really important for us.
Thank you.
I will go ahead and jump because it's right off of Jen's point. I think particularly I found mentorship to be incredibly valuable for that kind of exchange of tacit knowledge. And just, taking young experts under your wing, if you're a more established expert in the field, is a really impactful thing to do, I think, for the continuation of this kind of work. And then very quickly, just on what we can do as next generation experts. I think both Ileana and Jennifer, I agree completely with your points about being quite transparent. I think it's almost as important to note all the assumptions or the, what level of confidence you're putting into an estimate as it is to actually communicate the estimate itself. So that kind of transparency. And it is, I think I personally have been struggling with how to make it so that you can communicate in a way that's still digestible, because people do prefer just a number or just a yes or no answer, especially when, not everyone is a career watcher and has as much time as we do for these kind of convoluted estimates. So I think also just making sure that confidence is communicated in a very clear and concise way, as clearly and concisely as the estimates themselves.
Thank you. Haley and Sarah, you have the last word.
I believe that everyone here is steadily navigating the so-called swamp. While I use textual analysis in my study, but I believe that combining it with satellite imagery analysis would produce more meaningful result. To advance the field, I'd like to suggest two directions. First, establishing a shared data platform for North Korea related research. Allows hold substantial data individually, yet much of it remain fragmented. A common platform like a public database would provide a solid foundation for the field. And second, promote research projects together that integrate multiple methodologies. Listening to today's presentation, I wonder how interesting it will be if all of us analyze the same topic using different methods. Such a collaboration could not only deepen our understanding of a single subject, but also expand the methodological scope of North Korea studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you very much to all of you for your wonderful presentations and your great insights. There are so many threads that I would love to pull on just from the comments that you've made in the last 5 minutes, but I think we'll have to save that for another day. But the answers that you provided to the 2 questions have really given me personally some things to think about in terms of what I can do more for this field. We're 5 minutes over time, and Yeonho, I would like to turn this over to you now for your panel.
Thank you, Rachel. Now let's shift gears and move on to our next session, post-COVID open source intelligence on North Korea. First, I'd like to introduce our speaker, who will be discussing the challenges and changes in reporting on North Korea. Peter Oh is a former journalist and analyst with nearly 2 decades of experience reporting on North Korea. He has worked at Radio Free Asia and Daily NK, producing in-depth coverage of smuggling between North Korea and China, the trafficking of North Korean women in China, and untold stories from inside the country. His investigative work has been featured in major South Korean and US media, earning recognition across prominent news platforms. After defecting from North Korea, Peter earned his law degree from Yonsei University in Korea and later completed a master's in international policy and practice at George Washington University. Welcome back to your alma mater, Peter. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Peter.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Peter Oh. I've been working with Radio Free Asia in USA and South Korea for years. I'm honored to present my research project, which is a post-COVID-19 open source intelligence on North Korea, challenges and changes in the availability. Before I start, I would like to thank Professor Celeste Harrington and the Associate Director Kim for giving me this opportunity. Today I'm going to talk about 5 key topics. Number 1, how the North Korean news environment changed during COVID-19. Number 2, the impact of state secrets protection law and how can it intensify control of information in North Korea. Number 3, how reporting strategies have been adjusted. Number 4, characteristics of reporting on North Korea and regions of misinformation. Number 5, recommendations to improve access to information of North Korea. As the pandemic broke out in January 2020, and North Korea became the first country in the world to completely close its borders. Therefore, human intelligence networks disappeared. Normally, journalists rely on defectors, traders, and residents inside North Korea. But once the border closed, defections fell from more than 2,000 defectors to a year, but just fell down to just 63 in 2021. As the number of defectors decreased, reporters lost crucial due sources. The cross-checking became nearly impossible. Of course, not all defectors and smugglers have disappeared, but their numbers have decreased significantly compared to the past. In the same time, North Korea intensified border security, adding barbed wire, patrols, and thousands of new guard posts. Human Rights Watch analyzed satellite imagery of the North Korea-China border before and after COVID-19 and revealed DPRK expanded 321 kilometers of barbed wire fences along the border since 2020. DPRK declared a national emergency quarantine system, restricted all movement of inside the North Korean residents, and even ordered troops to shoot anyone entering the due 1 to 2 kilometer buffer zone in the border. Second challenge is phone surveillance. Interviews with inside residents became much more dangerous. In the past, journalists used the Chinese cell phone near the border area, and then government deployed signal detectors more, and anyone caught was harshly punished. According to Human Rights Watch, one woman defector said before 2019, she could call a family every week, but during the pandemic, she could call once every 2 months. Finally, both officials and unofficial were cut off. The main trade line with China along with the flights and smuggling routes was fairly shut down. Several analyses support the idea that North Korea used the pandemic to strengthen internal control. Now, report from the Korea Institute for National Security Strategy, which is North Korea's response to COVID-19 perception system and behavior, argued that North Korea viewed the pandemic not only as a public health issue, but as a grave national security crisis. Let me talk about state secrets protection law. In 2023, DPRK enacted this law. According to DPRK, the law was meant to protect secrets and safeguard national security, but it never actually defines what contents are as state secrets. North Korea's criminal code already had harsh penalties for treason, espionage, and leaking military information. So the real purpose of this new law seems to be expanding control. Authorities can now label almost any information, don't travel details, as classified. The biggest concern is that the full text of the law has never been released. Only partial decrees circulated inside North Korea, giving authorities wide discretion. Already, there are some reports from the NKEF and Radio Free Asia punished for mishandling documents. Officers disciplined for leaks, and even police checking people's phones in markets randomly. Now, let me move on to how journalists responded to these challenges during the pandemic. Journalists had to adapt quickly to the challenges with 6 main strategies. First, we strengthened trust with long-time sources. Communication was shorter and less frequent, but with technical support, informants continued sharing vital information. Second, journalists relied on indirect interviews by giving questionnaires to defectors who contact to their friends and families. Defectors contact families inside North Korea and ask them market prices, people's daily life, and quarantine measures of North Korea region. They still help their families by supporting them financially. Third, journalists more interviewed overseas North Korean people. For example, workers and diplomats strained abroad during pandemic. They offered valuable information on labor conditions and then government policies. Fourth, satellite imagery became more important. Tools like Planet Labs revealed military parades, Kim Jong-un's luxury villas, and even his luxury yachts. Sometimes pressuring this imagery report to press Pyongyang to confirm events. Fifth, open source material like KCNA and then 노동신문 were analyzed for publicly policy clues, but it should be always carefully cross-checked. Finally, humanitarian agencies such as UNICEF and WFP gave indirect insights into vaccines and aid shipments. Now, let me address about two characteristics of reporting on North Korea and the cause of misinformation. Since pandemic is very hard time, so there's not much cross-checking the route and channel. So reporting on North Korea is always risky because the country is closed. Access is limited and the cross-checking is nearly impossible. So journalists often face pressure. So fact-checking is very difficult. So rumors about Kim Jong-un's health or purges of senior officials may later prove true or false. But in the race to the publishing, reporters move too quickly to reduce errors. Two steps should be considered. First, raising North Korean specialized journalists with a strong interview capability and verification networks. Second, creating systematic cross-checking with experienced editors. Misinformation cannot be eliminated totally, but with better training journalists and then stronger verification and transparent correction, the risk can be reduced. Without safeguarding reporting, we remain trapped between scopes and errors. Research and policy remain vulnerable to distortion. Finally, I would like to offer some recommendations for strengthening access to North Korea information. First, open source intelligence is very critical for the US and South Korea and the international community. But outlets like Radio Free Asia and Daily NK cannot survive with advertisements or subscriptions only. Their job should be perceived as a public service sector. They need consistent financial and institutional support from governments and research centers to ensure independent, sustainable reporting. Second, human intelligence is still essential. Contacts with residents, overseas workers, and officials provide insights no other source can. Their safety must be protected with secure communication systems. And engagement with North Korea's abroad must be expanded. At the same time, we must take North Korea's counterintelligence strategies, such as manipulating and planting durs, or forged documents to expose informants. Supporting informants is an ethical responsibility. Since the pandemic, local sources have faced enormous risks, sometimes under the threat of the state secrets protection law, like a spy. Supporting them with fairly compensation is not just a financial matter, it is a moral obligation. Third, human-to-image and AI-based tools must be combined. Artificial intelligence can process huge enormous of data, but it only works when supported by reliable human source and imagery in intelligence. By integrating of them, AI can create clearer and more accurate information of North Korea. Only with these efforts can North Korea studies and policymaking secure on a more objective and effective foundations. This is all I have prepared for today. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for your excellent presentation. Before we open it up for Q&A, let me share a few comments on Peter's presentation and ask him some questions. As a former reporter for the Korean service at Radio Free Asia, or RFA, I could clearly see Peter's deep knowledge and experience in reporting on North Korea's internal affairs through his presentation. And I understand that RFA has played an important role as an alternative media outlet to North Korea's state-controlled press, providing North Koreans with a different perspective. However, the reality has been extremely challenging for RFA reporters who are not allowed to travel to or directly interview people inside North Korea, as Peter presented. Building and maintaining trust-based relationship with their informants over cell phones only must be very incredibly difficult. And at times, such work may even resemble intelligence gathering more than conventional journalism. And I think ensuring the safety of informants is absolutely essential in these activities. These individuals often risk their lives to cooperate with outside reporters, and we must remain acutely sensitive to that reality, especially when North Korea increasingly releases fake news or forged documents to identify internal sources who have leaked information to foreign media, as Peter said. And ideally, I think this type of reporting should be conducted systematically for the dedication and professionalism of individual reporters to bear fruit. Strong financial and technical support is indispensable. For instance, to help informants avoid surveillance, technical experts must be involved, and that in turn may require financial resources. And we often consume news stories produced by reporters like Peter without fully appreciating the inherent difficulties behind them. And I believe Peter's presentation today has greatly enhanced our awareness of these challenges. To ensure the credibility of such reporting, patience is essential. As Peter pointed out, the temptation to produce scoops can lead to the reporting of unverified rumors. In a competitive, for-profit media environment, that temptation is almost unavoidable, I think. And yet, I wonder whether nonprofit outlets like RFA should be left to face the same pressures. This, I believe, is more matter of policy than of individual professionalism. And when misinformation is reported, whether by for-profit or non-profit media, damage control must be prompt and thorough, involving frank acknowledgement of mistakes and clear remedies for the audience. And I hope such practices will become established as firm operational principles and ethical standards for media organizations dedicated to reporting on North Korea's internal affairs. And Peter also argued that we should provide local informants with fair financial compensation because they take extraordinary personal risk. Under normal journalistic standards, reporters are not supposed to pay informants, as doing so can compromise credibility, independence, and the perceived truthfulness of their reporting. And yet, how can we motivate informants in a context where information itself is criminalized and monopolized by the state? I think many researchers interviewing North Korean defectors in Korea face a similar dilemma. Compensating interviewees does not necessarily guarantee a truthful testimony, although it may encourage them to share their stories. Payments to North Korean informants, therefore, I think must be handled with great caution. But still, when dealing with a country that exercises extreme information control, I think we must also recognize the limits of conventional journalistic ethics here. With that, let me ask you a couple of questions, Peter. In your presentation, you emphasized the need to strengthen information production and verification systems, and the need to enhance cooperation among media outlets, research institutions, and security agencies to improve the reliability of the North Korea-related information and reporting. How do you see this working in practice?
Okay, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. There is two reasons why integrating is important. As I mentioned, Babu, unlike other private media organization, North Korea-related news organization, is said that it is a public service sector. This organization cannot operate itself because of financial difficulty. So government and security agency can help media and in return share information. This is a media organization situation. Number two, given North Korea deliberately manipulate information at the state level, establishing a strong verification system is crucial. This can be done by creating institutional cooperation between media outlets and research organizations, and by developing networks and data sharing mechanisms with security agencies. To make this work, related department should form TF to regularly exchange and verify critical information. Through such collaboration, research and policy on North Korea can be built on more objective and effective foundation. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question for you is this. You recommended integrating human, image, and AI-based intelligence to improve access to North Korea-related information. Could you tell us more about that? How should this integration work in practice? It sounds very great, but how can we do that?
Yeah. So, as the AI technology developing so fast recently, a lot of changes have been occurring around us. These changes offer a lot of new opportunities to process large volumes of data. However, AI analysis is only working as much as they received raw material. That's why it is essential to build a comprehensive framework that integrates human intelligence, imagery intelligence, and AI-based tools. Human sources provide context and ground data, while satellite imagery and open data supply the vital, visual, and quantitative evidence that AI can analyze more accurately. Only when these three elements work together, we expect objective and effective insights for research and policy on North Korea. Given that AI utilizes data-driven reasoning capabilities, the collection of information about North Korea through human intelligence should be strengthened, not weakened. Furthermore, internet technology companies such as Google and Meta should strengthen censorship to prevent North Korea infiltration through the internet and the YouTube. They spread propaganda right now, through YouTube and the internet the website. That content should distorted outside analyze and objective analysis. Thank you.
Thank you. We have around 4 minutes left, and I have one question from Bill Brown. Bill Brown, one of our the steering committee of the North Korea Economic Forum, members. His question is this: I am impressed by the ability of NK Daily and Japan's Asia Press to report exchange rates and prices every week or two for many years. The two series seem independent, but generally show a big rise in inflation in last year. 작년에 그러니까 물가가 많이 올랐다는데 미국간에서.
Yeah.
But you may have noticed they hugely diverged during Kim's trip to Beijing. Daily NK showing a huge burst of inflation, while Asia Press did not. 김정은이 베이징 갔을 때 나온 뉴스 리포트를 보면 데일리 NK는 물가가 엄청나게 올랐다고 하는데 아시아 프레스는 또 그렇지 않다는 거예요. So since then, they have converged. 그리고 난 다음에 이제 다시 비슷해졌는데, so my question is how reliable are these two sources? 이 두 매체가 그 서로 다른 얘기를 할 수도 있는데 어쩔 때는 그럴 때 독자들은 어디를 믿어야 될지 뭐 그런 이제 고민이 생기거든요. So, what's your opinion on this?
I think it depends on media's reporting on North Korea. Sometimes, previously, for example, in 2020, 2010, 2000, this era, they communicate to each local cannot like exchange information inside North Korea. So, if they can contact Yangon province source and can collect information about production price and inflation, and then someone like Asia Press reporter contact Sinuiju, Pyongan, North Pyongan province. So in this case, little bit different, but over time, for example, beyond 2010, like cell phone, delivered to people, and then many people use a cell phone. Internal information they can exchange easily. So I don't know. I cannot say which is media is right or wrong, but we can cross-checking like media, Daily NK, and then Asia Press and Radio Free Asia, and then you can compare and then can get information about this part.
Thank you. We're a little bit behind the schedule, but let me take one last question from Bill Newton, who is another steering committee member of the North Korea Economic Forum. His question is this: how do you determine that source knows what was claimed? How to obtain independent confirmation? 그래서 그 취재를 하셨을 때 누가 어떤 그 정보를 제공했는데 그거를 이제 확인해야 되잖아요. 그게 진실하다는 거를, 정확하다는 걸. 또 어떻게 하시냐? How do you confirm what your source told you?
In my case, when I get information from defector and then source inside the residence or Chinese source. First of all, checking through several channels. For example, I call senior officer, North Korea, former North Korea officer, and then call defector who used to live in that area. And as much as possible, you can contact inside North Korea, confirm this is true or not. So it takes time, and then that's why like error sometimes happen reporting on North Korea. So as I mentioned, this part, the final, it raises North Korea specialized journalists is very crucial to avoid misinformation and misreporting. Yeah, that's all. Yeah.
Yeah. With that, I think we have to conclude today's session. I'd like to thank all the distinguished speakers for joining us today. And I'd also like to thank the GWIX teams, Ravina and Habin, for putting this together. And of course, thank you all for joining us. With that, let me close today's discussions and see you again tomorrow, the second day of the North Korea Economic Forum Annual Conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
감사합니다.
감사합니다. 수고하셨습니다.